If Jesus knew that Judas would betray him, why didn't he simply stop him from going out that night? This is one of those questions that, when asked carefully, doesn't leave us in peace. Because it touches on something much deeper than a simple episode from the Bible. It forces us to confront how God deals with human choices, with evil, with freedom, and with a love that, contrary to what many imagine, does not control. Imagine the scene. The Last Supper doesn't take place in a solemn setting as many paintings suggest, but in an atmosphere heavy with silent tension. It's an intimate meal, among friends who have walked together for years. Jesus knows these are his last hours. The disciples sense that something is different, but they can't quite name what it is. There are unasked questions, restless glances, confused hearts. And as the atmosphere grows increasingly heavy, night falls outside. Darkness begins to take over not only the city, but also the emotional atmosphere of that place. Then something almost imperceptible happens. A simple gesture, a silent movement. The biblical text records it in few words, almost without explanation. And Judas went out, and it was night. Short, dry, disturbing. There is no speech, no confrontation, no attempt to stop him. Only the observation that Judas gets up, leaves the room, and disappears into the darkness. And it is precisely this simplicity that disconcerts us. Because if Jesus was who he said he was, if he knew hearts, if he knew exactly what was about to happen, why allow it? Have you ever experienced this? Have you ever read a passage from the Bible that seems small, almost irrelevant, but suddenly starts to bother you? This phrase carries enormous weight. It doesn't just talk about Judas. It talks about Jesus, about what he chooses to do, and about what he chooses not to do. And this is where many feel uncomfortable, because we are tempted to imagine a Jesus who prevents, who blocks, who forces the right path. A Jesus who doesn't let someone go out at night to commit the worst mistake of their life. But what we see is exactly the opposite. Jesus doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't grab Judas by the arm. He doesn't reveal his intentions to the others. He allows Judas to exercise his choice to the end. And this raises an inevitable question. Does Jesus' silence that night teach us something we rarely stop to consider? What does this attitude reveal about free will, divine sovereignty, and a love that prefers to suffer rather than control? Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may deeply surprise you. This scene, which goes unnoticed by many readers, holds one of the most challenging teachings about how God relates to us. It's not just about betrayal, but about freedom. It's not just about a human error, but about a greater purpose that is fulfilled even when choices are wrong. And, above all, it's not about a distant God, but about a Jesus who loves in a way that completely defies our expectations. As we delve into the specific moment of the Last Supper, each detail begins to take on a new meaning. The night, the silence, the gesture of leaving, the absence of hindrance. All of this builds a message that goes far beyond that table. A message that directly touches our own history, our decisions, and how we understand God's presence in the most critical moments. And that is exactly what we are going to begin to unravel now. And perhaps, as you listen to all this, some personal memory will begin to surface. Because deep down, this scene is not just old nor distant. It speaks to experiences that many of us have already lived through. Moments when someone we loved made a choice that we knew would bring pain. Situations where we were aware of what was going to happen, but we couldn't or weren't able to stop it. And that affects us. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Sometimes, writing down what we feel helps not only to organize our hearts, but also to show other people that they are not alone in their doubts and conflicts. Perhaps your story is different from Judas's, but the feeling of seeing someone go out at night, taking a path we know to be dangerous, is frighteningly familiar. And when you share this here, you transform this space into something bigger than a simple video. Your participation creates a real conversation, a community that reflects, questions, and grows together. That's why every comment truly matters. It's not just a number. It's a voice adding to so many others that also seek to better understand Jesus' gestures, silences, and attitudes. If at any point during this video you felt your heart tighten, or realize that this reflection speaks directly to your faith, liking the video is a simple yet powerful way to say, "This is important." This gesture helps the content reach more people who may be experiencing exactly this kind of inner conflict right now, unable to put their feelings into words. Your like pushes this message beyond your screen and allows it to reach other hearts. And if you feel that this type of reflection is good for you, that it provokes you and brings you closer to a deeper and more honest faith, subscribing to the channel is a natural step. Here, the proposal is precisely this: to look at the Bible attentively, to delve into the details that almost always go unnoticed and discover how they speak to our lives today. Your subscription shows that you want to walk together, that you value this type of content, and that you believe in the power of these conversations to transform thoughts and attitudes. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content. Every comment, every like, every new subscription helps keep this proposal of sincere reflection alive, without easy answers, but full of meaning. And as we continue to advance in this story, it's worth staying attentive, because what happens after Judas leaves deepens even further everything we've begun to perceive so far. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything changes when we understand that Judas' betrayal didn't take Jesus by surprise. Nothing that night escaped his knowledge. The Gospels make this clear in an almost disconcerting way. Even before Judas got up from the table, Jesus had already said that one of those eating with him would betray him, not as someone who suspects, but as someone who affirms something he already knows. He knows who it is, he knows what will be done, and he knows the impact it will have in the coming hours. Yet, he remains silent when the decisive moment arrives. This breaks a very common image that many people carry, the idea of a Jesus who reacts to events. Here, he doesn't react. He guides. And he does so in a way that completely challenges our mentality. Because if we're honest, when we know someone is going to hurt us, our tendency is to try to avoid, confront, prevent, or at least expose them. Jesus does the opposite. He reveals that he knows, but he doesn't interfere in the decision. And this is not carelessness, nor passivity, nor lack of authority. It's a conscious choice. When the text says that Jesus identifies Judas, hands him the piece of bread, and tells him to do what he is about to do, there is no nervous haste there. There is clarity. There is control of the situation. It's as if Jesus were saying, without needing to explain, none of this is out of control, even if it seems chaotic to human eyes. This attitude reveals a hidden truth that we often ignore. Knowing the future does not mean annulling it. Knowing what someone will do does not imply manipulating that person's decision. And this has a profound impact when we bring this scene into our own journey. How many times do we interpret God's silence as absence, when in fact it may be permission? How many difficult decisions do we make thinking that God isn't watching, when he already knows every outcome? Jesus' silence before Judas is not empty. It is full of meaning. It confronts us with the idea that some transformations only happen when freedom is taken to its limit. There is something extremely uncomfortable about this, because it forces us to face the fact that God will not always prevent wrong choices, even when they bring pain, loss, and rupture. And this does not diminish his sovereignty. On the contrary, it expands it. Jesus demonstrates that divine sovereignty is not expressed in obsessive control, but in purpose. He does not need to interrupt Judas's decision to continue being who he is. He does not need to force good for the plan to move forward. This scene also dismantles a superficial reading of betrayal. Judas is not a robot fulfilling an inevitable script. He acts on his own initiative. Jesus recognizes this and respects this space, even knowing the price. This leads us to an uncomfortable revelation. Jesus' love is not a love that binds, coerces, or threatens. It is a love that allows, even when allowing means suffering. And this completely changes how we understand relationships, faith, and responsibility. When someone who knows the future chooses not to interfere, they are teaching something far deeper than words could explain. You are teaching about spiritual maturity, about trusting in purpose even when the path leads through pain, about accepting that human decisions are part of the transformation process, even if they bring harsh consequences. Jesus doesn't try to save Judas from himself at that moment, and perhaps because some falls reveal truths that no warning could ever reveal. This realization also makes us look at our own decisions with more honesty. Sometimes we expect God to intervene spectacularly, when what he offers is awareness, clarity, silent presence. Jesus was there at the table looking Judas in the eyes. Nothing was hidden. Nothing was disguised. Yet the choice was made. And this shows that knowing the truth is not the same as following it. There is something extremely human in this scene, and at the same time profoundly divine. Jesus does not run from the suffering he knows will come. He does not try to negotiate the future. He walks towards it with clarity. This reveals a mindset that goes against everything we have learned about power. True power lies not in preventing everything that can go wrong, but in sustaining purpose even when everything seems to crumble. And perhaps this is where this story begins to affect us more personally. Because, on some level, we have all faced choices that we knew would lead us. And yet, we chose. Sometimes, God doesn't shout. He observes. Not out of indifference, but because he respects the process. And that's part of the journey of faith, even if it's uncomfortable to admit. This interpretation completely changes the way we see the Last Supper, Judas, and Jesus himself. Nothing there is improvised. Nothing is weak. Everything is intentional. And the closer we get to this detail, the more we realize that this scene is not just about betrayal, but about decisions, freedom, and a love that refuses to control. A love that trusts in purpose even when it goes through the night. Comment below, this makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here we touch on a point that often generates real discomfort. Free will taken to its ultimate consequences. When we look at Judas attentively and honestly, it becomes impossible to maintain the idea that he was forced, manipulated, or pushed into betrayal. He was not a pawn without free will on a divine chessboard. He made choices, conscious choices, progressive choices, and this changes everything, because it forces us to leave behind a comfortable interpretation and confront a hidden truth that we often prefer to avoid. Jesus doesn't control choices, not even those that deeply hurt. This statement, when taken seriously, challenges our mindset about faith, God, and responsibility. Because the image of a God who controls every detail brings us security, but also exempts us. The image of a God who respects decisions, however, confronts us. Judas walked with Jesus, heard the same teachings, witnessed the same miracles, and had the same opportunities as the other disciples. Yet he chose a different path, and Jesus allowed it. This doesn't mean approval. Allowing is not agreeing. It means respecting the space of decision. Judas wasn't stopped, he wasn't forcibly exposed, he wasn't publicly unmasked before his time. He chose to leave. He chose the night. And this detail is fundamental, because it reveals that free will is not just a beautiful theory, but a reality that carries weight, consequences, and real impact. God could prevent many wrong decisions, but often he doesn't. And this doesn't happen through negligence, but because freedom is an essential part of the human journey. When we bring this to our own experience, identification is almost inevitable. How many times, looking back, do we realize that some pain could have been avoided? How many wrong choices could have been stopped? How many dark paths could have been closed before they became so deep? Yet they remained open. And this raises difficult questions. Why didn't God prevent it? Why did he let it happen? Why did he allow me to go to the limit? Perhaps because maturity doesn't happen without responsibility. Perhaps because true transformation doesn't spring from blocked paths, but from decisions made. Judas cannot blame Jesus for his choice. You cannot say you were deceived or forced. And this reality is harsh, because it holds a mirror up to us. Often we want a God who intervenes before the mistake, but we don't want to bear the weight of the consequences when we choose to ignore the signs. There is something profoundly human in this dynamic. God does not take away freedom even when he knows it will be misused. This teaches us that genuine love is not control, it is risk. It is allowing the other to choose, even when that may result in rejection, loss, or betrayal. Jesus knew he would be hurt, abandoned, and betrayed. Yet, he did not close the doors to decision. This reveals a type of love that does not impose itself, does not manipulate, and is not sustained by fear. This understanding also helps us deal with guilt in a more mature way. Judas made a choice, and that brings responsibility. But responsibility doesn't exist without freedom. When we take away freedom, we also take away the possibility of growth, repentance, and change. God doesn't want obedient robots, but conscious people. And consciousness only exists when there is real choice. even choices that hurt. At the same time, this scene comforts us in an unexpected way. Because if God allows wrong choices, it doesn't mean he abandons the process. He remains present, even when the decision takes us away. Jesus didn't stop loving Judas when he got up from the table. He didn't stop seeing him as a person. The love remains, but the control doesn't. And this distinction is one of the most profound revelations of this story. How many times do we confuse love with control in our own relationships? How many times do we think that protecting means preventing, that caring means deciding for the other, that loving means avoiding any pain? Jesus shows the opposite. He allows Judas to live his choice to the end, even knowing the impact it would bring. And this teaches us that some pain is part of the process of inner revelation. It exposes intentions, reveals motivations, and shows who we really are when no one stops us. This reflection also changes how we view our own nights. There are decisions we make knowing they aren't the best. There are paths we choose even when we see the warnings. And yet, we continue. Could God prevent it? He could. But often he allows it, because he knows that true change doesn't come from coercion, but from internal confrontation with the consequences of one's own choices. And the more we think about it, the more we realize that this story isn't just about Judas, but about all of us. About responsibility, freedom, and the courage to stand by our decisions. Jesus didn't negate free will, not even when it came at a high price. And this reveals a God who deeply respects humanity, even when it fails. This understanding naturally leads us to look beyond the choice itself and begin to perceive something even deeper behind this permission. Because allowing is not the same as losing control. There is something happening behind the scenes of this story that connects human freedom and a greater purpose in a way that we don't always immediately perceive. That's where the reflection begins to gain new layers and the journey deepens even further. Write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's a very common misconception when we talk about divine sovereignty. Many people associate sovereignty with absolute control, as if God were manipulating every step, every decision, every human mistake. But the scene in Judas shows us something very different, and perhaps much harder to accept. Sovereignty is not control, it's purpose. Allowing doesn't mean losing control of history. It means guiding it in a way that goes beyond our immediate logic. When Judas leaves at night, nothing goes off track. Nothing deviates from the plan. In the eyes of the disciples, it seemed like the beginning of the end, the collapse of everything they had built alongside Jesus. But, behind the scenes, something much greater was in motion. The betrayal did not thwart God's plan. Paradoxically, it was part of the path by which that plan was fulfilled. And this compels us to deeply reconsider our mindset about how God acts in the world. God does not lose control when human beings make bad choices. He is not surprised by error, nor disarmed by betrayal. Divine sovereignty operates on a deeper level, where even bad decisions are incorporated into a greater purpose. This does not make evil good, nor does it transform betrayal into something desirable, but it reveals that betrayal does not have the final say. Judas acts by his own choice, and that choice is real, responsible, and laden with guilt. Yet God is not defeated by it. This is a point that completely changes the reading of the biblical text. Jesus does not walk to the cross despite the betrayal. He walks to the cross even through it. Nothing that happens that night interrupts the purpose. On the contrary, every detail seems to advance the story in the exact direction of what needed to happen. This does not diminish the gravity of human error, but amplifies the dimension of divine sovereignty. When we understand this, something begins to reorganize itself within us. Because we begin to realize that God does not depend on human perfection to accomplish his plans. He works with real people, full of conflicts, flaws, and wrong decisions. The Bible doesn't hide this. It exposes it. And precisely for this reason, it offers us a more honest view of faith, less idealized and much more transformative. This understanding also helps us deal with moments when everything seems to have spiraled out of control. Those periods in life when wrong decisions, ours or others, cause profound ruptures. Betrayals, losses, thoughtless choices. Situations where we look back and think, that wasn't part of the plan, but perhaps it was. Not as a wish, but as part of a larger path that we haven't yet been able to fully see. God's sovereignty does not eliminate suffering, but it ensures that it is not in vain. Even the pain caused by wrong decisions can be channeled through a purpose that goes beyond the immediate. Judas did not escape responsibility for his choice, but his betrayal could not prevent what needed to happen for redemption to be fulfilled. This is one of the deepest and most difficult aspects of the Christian faith, because it compels us to hold two truths at the same time. Human freedom is real, and so is God's purpose. This changes how we view our own stories. Perhaps some decisions have had impacts you never wanted. Perhaps mistakes have opened wounds that still hurt. And yet, this doesn't mean your journey has lost its meaning. Divine sovereignty acts precisely there, gathering fragments, rearranging paths, and guiding the story toward something we cannot yet see clearly. Jesus didn't try to salvage the plan by stopping Judas. He trusted in the purpose that would transcend even that decision. And this reveals an authority that isn't based on control, but on absolute trust in what is being built. An authority that doesn't panic in the face of human error, because it knows that the outcome doesn't depend solely on human choices. This perspective takes us away from a fragile faith, which crumbles in the face of any failure, and leads us to a more mature faith, capable of dealing with ambiguity, pain, and questions without easy answers. Judas' betrayal was not the collapse of the plan, but one of the paths by which it advanced. And this forces us to look at history more deeply, realizing that not everything that seems like defeat is truly the end. When we begin to see things this way, something changes within us. We begin to understand that God is not reacting desperately to our decisions, but walking with us through them. Even when we err, even when we fail, even when someone goes out at night and leaves everything behind, there is something greater being built, silently, behind the scenes. This realization sets the stage for an even more sensitive and personal revelation, because if sovereignty is not control and if purpose continues even in the face of betrayal, then an inevitable question arises about the nature of Jesus' love in this process. A love that allows, that suffers, and that chooses not to impede, even though it has all the power to do so. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here we touch perhaps on the most delicate, most human, and most disconcerting point of this whole story, the love of Jesus. A love that doesn't bind, doesn't threaten, and doesn't force. A love that, in our eyes, even seems too vulnerable. Because if there was a moment when Jesus could have acted differently, that moment was there, at that table. He could have confronted Judas directly. He could have exposed his intentions before everyone. He could have created such a great public embarrassment that it prevented him from leaving. He could have used authority, words, power, but he did none of that. Instead, Jesus does something that completely breaks our logic. He offers the bread. He washes the feet. He keeps Judas at the table until the end. He treats the traitor with the same dignity with which he treats others. And then he allows him to get up and leave, without shouting, without scandal, without coercion. This is not weakness. It is a radical choice to love without controlling. This detail changes everything when we think about the image we often project onto God. A God who forces, who threatens, who holds people back through fear of punishment. But Jesus reveals the opposite. He shows a love that respects the freedom of others so much that it accepts the risk of rejection. A love that does not impose itself, even though it has all the power to do so. A love that prefers to suffer rather than violate the will of another. And that hurts. It hurts because it goes against our instinct for self-protection. When we know someone is going to hurt us, our tendency is to build walls, create defenses, anticipate the blow. Jesus doesn't do that. He continues to love. He continues to serve. He continues to offer space. This reveals a hidden truth about the nature of divine love. God doesn't want captive followers. He wants true relationships. And true relationships only exist where there is real freedom. This love also confronts us in our own relationships. How often do we confuse love with possession, care with control, zeal with manipulation? How often do we try to prevent others from making choices not out of love, but out of fear of losing them? Jesus shows that loving is not about guaranteeing that the other person will stay, but about allowing them to choose, even if it means leaving. Judas leaves because he can leave. And this possibility is an essential part of the authenticity of that relationship. There is something profoundly transformative in this realization. because it changes our mindset about faith. God doesn't keep us by his side out of fear, guilt, or pressure. He invites us, he offers himself, he serves, and then he respects our response. Even when that response is no. Even when that response comes in the form of betrayal, abandonment, or rejection. The scene of the washing of the feet takes on even greater weight when we remember that Judas was there. Jesus kneels before the one who would betray him. He touches his feet. He performs a gesture of extreme humility, knowing exactly what that man would do hours later. This is not naivete. This is conscious love. A love that sees the whole truth and still chooses to serve. This kind of love disconcerts us because it doesn't operate on the logic of exchange. It doesn't love expecting something in return. It doesn't serve expecting guaranteed fidelity. It loves because of who he is. And perhaps that's why this story continues to impact generations. Because it reveals a God who doesn't treat us as replaceable parts, but as free people, even when that freedom is used against him. There is something extremely relevant in all of this today. We live in a culture of control, where everything needs to be predicted, guaranteed, secured. Fragile relationships, based on fear of loss, constant demands, and emotional games. Jesus presents another way, a way where love doesn't suffocate, doesn't watch over, doesn't threaten, a love that trusts in the value of free choice. This doesn't make the love any less intense. It makes it more real, because loving like this requires courage. It requires maturity. It requires accepting that not everyone will reciprocate. It requires dealing with the pain of rejection without giving up one's own essence. Jesus doesn't stop being who he is to avoid pain. He goes through pain remaining faithful to love. And perhaps this is one of the most profound revelations of this story. God prefers to be rejected than to control. He prefers to be hurt than to manipulate. He prefers to lose people than to lose the truth of love. This completely changes how we understand spiritual authority, leadership, faith, and our relationship with God. It's not about fragile love, but about a love so strong that it doesn't need to impose itself. When we look at Judas leaving, we don't just see betrayal. We see a love that respects until the end. A love that doesn't force doors shut. A love that remains whole even when the other chooses darkness. And this invites us to a very personal reflection. How have we loved? Have we loved to possess or to liberate? Have we loved to guarantee permanence or to respect choices? This question keeps echoing because it's not limited to that night in Jerusalem. It permeates our journey, our relationships, our daily decisions. And the closer we get to this kind of love revealed in Jesus, the more we realize that it's not comfortable, but profoundly true. A love that doesn't control, but transforms. A love that doesn't force, but invites. Comment below, this love challenges me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after looking at Judas, at Jesus, at the night, at the silence, and at this uncontrollable love, the question inevitably turns to us. What does this night teach you about yourself today? Because, if we're honest, this story hasn't survived for 2,000 years simply because it speaks of betrayal, but because it reveals something that transcends generations. The constant tension between wanting to be protected from ourselves and, at the same time, wanting to be free. How often do we desire a God who prevents our falls, but not a God who respects our choices? We want deliverance without responsibility, protection without confrontation, care without freedom. Deep down, we want God to save us from the consequences, but not interfere too much in what we decide to do. And it is precisely here that this scene from Judas's night begins to truly disturb us, because it exposes a hidden truth about our own spiritual mindset. We all have our nights out, silent decisions made away from the eyes of others, when no one is watching and when the heart has already inclined toward a specific path. They are not necessarily grand public betrayals. Sometimes they are internal choices, avoided conversations, negotiated values, shortcuts accepted, justifications carefully constructed. Small steps that, added together, lead us away from the light without us immediately realizing it. And many of these choices happen in the presence of God. Just as Judas was at the table, so are we. We listen, we learn, we feel, we experience. Yet, at some point, we rise. Not because we were expelled, but because we decided to. This is difficult to admit, because it takes us out of the position of victims and places us in the position of those responsible. But it also gives us back something precious: conscience. The night of Judas teaches us that God does not act like a nervous watchman, ready to prevent every wrong step. He acts like someone who respects the journey, even knowing where it may lead. This does not mean indifference. It means trust in the freedom that he himself granted. And this trust, paradoxically, is one of the greatest proofs of love. Perhaps you've looked back and thought that God could have prevented certain decisions. He could have closed doors, created obstacles, caused greater discomfort. And perhaps he even did that at times. But at other times, he didn't. And that wasn't abandonment. It was permission. A permission that carries enormous weight, because it forces us to deal with the consequences and with what those consequences reveal about us. This story invites us to stop asking only, "Why did God allow this?" and start asking, "What does this choice reveal about me?" It reveals priorities. It reveals desires. It reveals fears. It reveals wounds. It reveals what truly governs our decisions when no one is interfering. And this revelation, though painful, is a fundamental step in inner transformation. Jesus allowing Judas to leave is not a distant or overly theological gesture. It is profoundly practical. He shows us that God does not build relationships on coercion. He builds them on invitation. And invitation always involves the possibility of refusal. This possibility does not weaken love. It only makes it true. When we understand this, our journey of faith ceases to be a search for absolute guarantees and becomes a walk of conscious choices. We don't follow God because we are prevented from leaving, but because we choose to stay. We don't remain in the light because the darkness has been locked away, but because we decide not to walk towards it. This completely changes the dynamic of the relationship. And perhaps that's why this scene is so relevant today. We live surrounded by choices, stimuli, possible paths. Many of them silent, nocturnal, seemingly harmless. And yet, God doesn't force us. He remains at the table. He continues to offer bread. He continues to wash feet. He remains present. The decision, in the end, remains ours. Jesus' gesture that night isn't just about Judas. It's about all of us. About how God deals with our decisions, about how true love respects freedom, and about how mature faith is born when we stop outsourcing our choices. This understanding doesn't end the story. It deepens it. Because when we look at our own nights, we begin to realize that there is still much to be understood about what we do after we get up from the table. Comment below, "This makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation has resonated with you. And that, in itself, says a lot. If this kind of reflection helps you see faith more deeply, the Bible more honestly, and your own journey more clearly, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue walking together. Here, the goal is always this: to go beyond the surface, to look at the details, the gestures, and the silences that transform the way we understand God and ourselves. If this message spoke directly to you, leave a comment writing, "This message was for me." This helps create a space for genuine exchange between people who are seeking meaning, growth, and transformation, each at their own pace, but on the same journey. And if throughout the video you felt a connection, reflection, or even that inner silence that makes you think, liking the video is just a way of signaling that, of saying that this conversation was worthwhile. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this line of thought. Click and continue with me there. The journey continues, and there's still much to be revealed.